Good evening. I'm laughing because I think I've got a really bad reputation of showing up late. Actually, my publisher in the UK told me a very similar story. He said, he and I had a lunch appointment for 1 o'clock lunch, and he called me at around 1:30 and said, where are you? It's lunchtime. We had a lunch appointment. And he said he wasn't too sure whether to appreciate my honesty or to be offended that I was half an hour late, because my response to him was, oh my God, I forgot, but I'll be there shortly. In any case, I did make it, and I did make it for our meeting, and thank you very much for all of you being here this evening. I want to tell a very quick story that I know a number of people in this room have heard me tell already, and this has to do with these labels and all these sort of platitudes and things. But a few months ago, I arrived at JFK, New York, quite late at night, and I really was not in the mood. I got to immigration, and I was actually in quite a bad mood because I was pretty tired. I was flying in from London, and got to the little immigration booth, and the immigration officer said to me, what is it exactly that you do? And I said, I'm an economist. And the immigration officer said, you're a communist? And actually, I've met a communist. And so, with my indignation, said, no, I'm an economist. I mean, of course, I was partly quite defensive because I was slightly worried that I might get thrown in jail. I mean, who admits to being a communist in America? But in any case, I said, no, I'm an economist. And the woman said to me, well, I don't know why you're getting all haughty. It's not like you predicted the financial crisis or anything. So I stand here today as a communist. No, but on a serious note, thank you very much. This is, I think, my 5th time to Vancouver. I love coming here. And today I have to say, for all the complaints about how much it rains in this city, this is the first time it's rained while I've been here. So it's once again fun to be here, and glad to see so many friends in the audience. It's interesting because when I go to places where I've spoken before about my first book, Dead Aid, and issues around aid to Africa, and then I subsequently go back to the city a year later, like as I am now, to talk about my new book, How the West Was Lost. In pre-cocktails, people always say to me, I really want you to say something about aid to Africa. I really want you to talk to some of the issues of your first book. And so over time, I've kind of tried to perfect my speech a little bit. And try to link the two books, because there actually is a very clear linkage between the two books, an overarching theme, which is unintended consequences. I'm going to very quickly whiz through, because I've been given strict instructions to speak for only maximum 30 minutes, so I can give more time to Q&A. Apparently, previous speakers have spoken for as long as an hour and a half, and I actually think that... No, but Lucas, would you like me to speak for an hour and a half? I'd be like... But anyway, I'm sure my parents also called to say, can you keep it short? So I will do that this evening. So I want to talk about this idea of unintended consequences, the idea of good intentions that yield bad outcomes. And it's not just a theme in aid to Africa. It also is a running theme in policymaking in Western economies today. So let me spend a few minutes talking about this idea of unintended consequences for aid to Africa, and then I'll link into unintended consequences and how we see the repeat patterns sort of emerging in policymaking in Western economies today. And I should point out, a friend of mine said to me quite recently, when I made this exact point, they said to me, well, perhaps it's not so surprising that we're seeing unintended consequences in African policymaking as well as in Western countries, because the policymakers are the same. And so when you look back over the past 50 years, it shouldn't be surprising, because it's actually the same people making policies. So the running theme makes perfect sense. But let's talk a little bit first about the idea of, as I said, unintended consequences in the context of aid to Africa. And I should say, all my work is really an appeal to reason, so I'm hoping that people will be nodding emphatically as I say certain things. I mean, I'm not trying to say things that have never been said. I'm not trying to say things that are somehow controversial or shocking. I think really it's an appeal to reason and logic and sensibility, so I hope it will resonate with you. But in the context of aid to Africa, let me start by saying I think there are 3 things that we all agree on. The first thing is that nobody wants to see Africa remain dependent on aid forever. I think we all yearn, hope, look forward to the day when Africa and Africans can be equal participants in the global economy, and we don't have this sort of dichotomy of us versus them, but Africans are actually around the table helping to design global economic policy. So I think we broadly agree on that. We don't like to see the poverty and disease. We want to see Africa emerge from destitution. The second thing I think we absolutely all agree on, whether we love aid or hate aid, is that African governments need to lead the charge. So it's kind of pointless for us to sit in Vancouver and say, gosh, we need to give more aid to Africa, because no matter what we do, the fact of the matter is that if African governments are not motivated to do the right thing, we're not getting anywhere. And it doesn't matter if it's Western individuals, Western governments, or even African individuals like myself. The fact of the matter is if African governments are not doing what they're supposed to do, we might as well forget it. So we need to figure out and find ways to incentivize African governments to do the right thing. The third thing that we agree on, I believe, is actually, I'm completely plagiarizing comments from the Minister of International Development, Minister Sondheim, who invited me to Norway when my book first came out. And I was quite surprised because Norway gives about 1% of its income to aid. And I thought, gosh, why does he want me to go to Oslo? I mean, it's not like my book is praising aid and this country gives so much aid. But I ended up going, and in the course of a meeting in front of about 50 journalists, he said to me, look, Dambisa, the fact of the matter is whether we love aid or hate aid, we all have to accept that aid has contributed to the dysfunctionality of the African state. And I think that was incredibly important, particularly given the second point that I mentioned, that we need to get African governments motivated. We'll talk a lot about this dysfunctionality in a few minutes, but suffice it to say at this point that I think he's absolutely right, that aid has contributed to dysfunctionality. What do I mean by aid? I guess there are three types of aid, really, when you think about it. The first type of aid is what we call humanitarian aid. You have a crisis in Japan or in Katrina, or there's an earthquake or flood. I'm not here to discuss that type of aid. I think there's a moral imperative for us as human beings to step in when those type of calamities happen. The second type of aid is sort of NGO aid, where we send, I don't know, $20 for a Zambian girl to go to school or to build a well in Indonesia. The fact of the matter is that that's really small beer, small amounts of money. The reality is Africa needs to grow at 7% a year on a sustained basis in order to meaningfully put a dent in poverty. Is sending $20 going to do anything meaningful? Probably not. And it's probably a good time to remind ourselves that out of a billion people on the African continent, 60% of Africans are under the age of 24. And in some countries, 50% of Africans are under the age of 15. Very young population. What we're seeing across North Africa and the Middle East right now, to me, is really a reflection of people's agitation and real anger around the lack of economic opportunities, and perhaps less so about democracy or governance per se. So I think the reality is we need to all be quite more humble about what those type of aid interventions, NGO charitable type of aid interventions, can really do in job creation and actually meaningfully changing things on these continents. So my book is not really about NGO aid. It's really about the third type of aid, which is these large billion-dollar packages that go to Africa and to other parts of the emerging world on a regular basis. It amounts to about over $1 trillion of aid has gone from Western economies to Africa in particular over the last 50 years. And we can spend the whole evening talking about a whole list of things that have happened because of that aid. I won't bore you with those details because I want you to read the book. But suffice it to say, it's everything from corruption, contributing to civil wars. Africa's had more civil wars in the 1990s than the rest of the world put together. Even as we speak this evening, we're just chatting on the table. There are conflicts in Côte d'Ivoire, still political issues in Zimbabwe, Somalia, failed state, Libya. in North Africa, we know the story. So the reality is, and in the past 18 months, we've seen 4 coup d'etats, overthrow of government. So there's still a lot of political instability. My former PhD supervisor has written extensively on this because there are clear linkages between political uncertainty and aid culture, because people are constantly factions are trying to take over the government, which is where the aid money pools. I don't really want to spend much more time talking about the concerns around inflation and the debt burden and all the issues that emanate from an aid-based society. But what I do want to leave you with in terms of how these unintended consequences are particularly damaging for Africans is to say that it does absolutely erode our ability as Africans to hold our governments accountable. I was just in Boston a few weeks ago, and I was reminded of the original Tea Party, which is the original Boston Tea Party, not the new one, where there was a saying that there's no taxation without representation. Well, in Africa, it's quite the opposite. We have no representation without taxation. The fact that African governments do not need to tax Africans in order to stay in power means that the veracity, the strength of the contracts between individuals like myself and the African government is absolutely eroded. Let me put it another way. In Canada, you have an implicit contract between yourselves as individuals and your government. And it kind of goes like this. Mr. Harper says, I'm going to tax you, and in return for those taxes, I'm going to provide you with what economists call public goods. Things like infrastructure, national security, education, healthcare, and so on. So public goods are just things that we all enjoy, but none of us pay for individually. So Don's hospital will be a good example of that. But let's think about this. So what happens in Canada if the government doesn't deliver? They don't provide you the education or the healthcare that you want. Well, you vote them out. But the fact of the matter is, in the context of Africa and many emerging economies, African governments depend, and they court and cater, very rationally court and cater the international community, the donors, instead of caring about what individuals on the ground like myself want in terms of the delivery of these public goods. So what happens when African governments don't deliver, and we know they don't deliver, what ends up happening is that they ignore us, and they spend their time getting more money from the aid donors. It's in such a state that one African president said to me, Dambisa, the fact of the matter is that we're very rational. We know that if we can show the donors that we have more AIDS, more disease, more poverty, more destitution in our economies, we get more aid money. He's absolutely right, because fundamentally we have skewed incentives. We actually reward, very much like education in the US, which we're going to come to in a minute, but we're rewarding people for in fact, they're holding us hostage, rewarding people for bad behavior. And I think that implicitly goes against the grain for issues around incentives that have driven the success of Western economies. The second half of my book, Dead Aid, actually talks about solutions. And somebody said to me, and I don't see her now, but someone said to me, please, can you be positive? We don't want to hear more bad news. So anyway, what I will say is the second half of my book has got solutions, what Africa should be doing. And I'm sure it will not be surprising to you that much of what's in there are the things that countries like Canada and the US and many of the emerging economies, China and Brazil and so on, are doing. And unfortunately, there remains one policy of economic development for Africa and a completely different approach to economic development for other countries. And it's that problem that I was hoping to address. Let me spend a few minutes now talking about these unintended consequences in the context of Western policymaking, which is really what I was dealing with in my second book, How the West Was Lost. And I think rather than go through sort of a number of examples of how these unintended consequences appear, I'm going to give one example. But the way the book is laid out is I focus really on the 3 key ingredients that drive economic growth. So economists in the room will be very familiar with the fact that as economists, we tend to focus on capital, which is basically money, labor, which is the workforce, and then there's this X factor, which is called total factor productivity. So everything we don't understand as economists, we shove into total factor productivity. And it's everything from institutions and governance and transparency, rule of law, and technology. I'm not going to go through all of those. What I want to do is just spend a couple of minutes talking about unintended consequences, in particular, in as much as they pertain to capital. As I said, the book is littered with other examples around unintended consequences for labor, which is pensions and so on, but also unintended consequences in the technology and total factor productivity in general. But let me give you a specific example of the unintended consequences that have emerged in Western society, particularly in the United States, around capital. And the specific point here is the issues of subprime crisis. And I think it's quite apropos because we're still emerging from those, and we still feel a lot of those effects. And here, the real umbrella issue around unintended consequences is something called the Housing for All policy. And it's basically a policy that was set up in the United States back in the 1950s, post-war period. And basically, Republicans and Democratic administrations alike have pushed this idea of housing for all. And the good intention here is that they wanted to provide housing for all Americans. Good idea. But the unintended consequences is that we've ended up with the subprime crisis. So you might be saying to yourself, well, why is such a good idea giving housing to everybody ended up in such a bad outcome? Well, it's because fundamentally the American government became a portfolio manager and decided to pick housing as a better asset class than other asset classes. What do I mean? People who invest in this room will know that we've got a whole range of asset classes. There's cash, there's stocks, bonds, commodities, property, real estates, both in commercial and private, personal housing. But what the US government did is to decide that they found housing in particular attractive, and they changed the policy environment to artificially make housing look more attractive than other asset classes. So very rationally, individuals across the United States invested their earnings into the housing market. You might say, well, how did they do that? Well, they did that by keeping interest rates low, as we know. But in addition, they formed the mortgage market, and they also provided, through subsidy programs and guarantees, and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, for example, they created an environment where housing looked much more attractive than any of the other asset classes. So looking back, it's actually perfectly rational that people invested in the housing market, but actually, as a practical initiative, we've ended up with the subprime crisis. Now, I know some people in this room are going to say, well, you worked at Goldman Sachs, so you're going to give the bankers a free pass. I'm not here to do that. The bankers are obviously culpable, but what I will say, well, in part culpable, I should say, but what I will say is that the bankers actually would never have invested in the subprime market if there had not been guarantees and promises from the public policy environment. And I think that's an important lesson that we should learn. Let me just sum up by saying the following about these two areas. And I'm sure a lot of stuff will come up in Q&A. But the fundamental point is that we live in a time right now where governments are driven by these unintended consequences because they tend to be short-term, myopic sort of teasers for us all. We're so focused on short-term electoral processes that governments very rationally make promises that over the long term can be incredibly damaging. So, for example, if I had been a policymaker in the 1950s and 1960s, I absolutely would have supported aid. It sounded like a great idea. Let's give aid to Africa. We want to help these African countries. We're coming out of the Marshall Plan, which is about $100 billion that was sent to Europe. It had been, by all accounts, incredibly successful. But the fact of the matter is here we are, sort of 50 years later, and it's very clear that aid hasn't worked. We can look at pensions, we can look at the subprime market. These are unintended consequences are things that in the short term sound incredibly attractive, but in the long term almost invariably cause problems. So what do I want to leave you with here? How is it that we get governments to actually focus on these long-term, more structural issues and not get obsessed with more tactical short-term issues? So in the US right now, they're constantly talking about the budget deficit, which is obviously an important thing, but they spend almost no time really addressing more structural long-term problems such as education, energy efficiency, things like infrastructure. So the question then becomes, how do we get them to do that? Now, obviously they're very rational, these policymakers, because they know that if they focus on these short-term issues, they can actually try and solve them or be seen to be solving them, and we as voters reward them for making that effort. They would never stand up and say, I want to do energy policy change, because these things seem rather intractable. They're long-term structural problems that can be very difficult to address. And so the question is, how do we force governments to move away from just focusing on short-term tactical things to move into more long-term structural solutions? And I'm going to close by proposing two. One is you lengthen the democratic processes. So instead of having elections every 2 years as they do in the United States, you could do something like what happens in Mexico and Brazil, where you extend political terms to 6 years. One term, instead of having multiple, sort of in the US, 2 presidential terms, 4 years each, you get 1 term for 6 years. This could force or help governments, just give them a bit more wiggle room to focus on more structural things. The other thing that you could do is actually basically incentivize or almost pay policymakers to do the right thing. And it might not just be policymakers, it might be us as individuals who need to be rewarded or paid to do the right thing. And so let me give you a very quick example. In Mexico and Brazil, they have what are called conditional transfers. And essentially what happens is that the government pays people to send their kids to school. So you send your child to school and they have a 98% attendance rate, you get $100. Your child gets inoculated, you get $100. Right now, Mayor Bloomberg in New York has rolled out a program in the United States. He's testing this theory using his own money to see whether or not you can try and do the same kind of principles in the United States. In Britain, they're also looking at this in education. They're saying, well, if your child decides to go and do maths and sciences, which are really important for the long-term functioning of the British economy, well, then maybe we should give you $1,000 or some amount of money over somebody who perhaps has their child going to do social sciences. And by the way, I'm a social scientist as well, so I'm not slagging off the social sciences. But the idea is everything is on the table right now, because we're at a time where, in terms of education, in terms of capital, in terms of labor, those 3 key ingredients that I touched on earlier, Western countries are decidedly back-footed, and it's pretty clear that countries like China and many of the other emerging economies have got it right. So what I'm going to do is stop here, and thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.